She had nothing left. No fortune, no family, and no real choice of her own. The will made the decision for her. 6 months in his manor, under his rules, in a place no one entered willingly and no one remembered kindly. Rowan said nothing when she arrived. He only looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he expects to solve quickly, cleanly, without complication. But he was wrong. Anna was not something that could be solved. She was the one thing in his carefully ordered life that refused to fit, no matter how much he tried to contain it. And the moment she stepped through his door, something in him, something that had remained untouched for years, shifted in a way he did not understand. He didn't notice it then, for he would spend the next 6 months trying to convince himself it had never happened. If this is your kind of story, you're in the right place. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support truly means a lot. Drop your city in the comments. I love knowing where our stories reach. Now, listen carefully. The morning she arrived, the sky over Yorkshire had the colour of old pewter, heavy and still, the kind of grey that presses down on everything beneath it and has no intention of lifting. The gravel in the drive of Hale Manor was wet from the night before, and the stones of the facade caught the flat morning light and gave nothing back. It was the kind of house that had been built to last centuries, and every line of it, the height of the walls, the symmetry of the tall windows, the ivy permitted to climb the east face but cut back sharply at the front, made that fact impossible to ignore. Hannah Reed stepped down from the carriage without waiting for the footman's hand, and stood still for a moment on the wet gravel, not because the scale of the manor overwhelmed her, but because she was reading it the way she read everything that mattered, without rushing, without reaching for a conclusion before the evidence was complete. She noted the entrance steps, clean and exact, the smell of damp stone and wood smoke carried on the cold air, and the single figure standing at the top of the steps with his hands behind his back and his eyes already fixed on her. And then she started walking toward him, her steps steady across the wet gravel, her chin level, her hands still at her sides. Duke Rowan Hale watched her cross the drive, and his jaw held for 1 second longer than it should have. She did not slow as she approached. She did not tilt her head back to take in the full height of the manor, did not smooth her coat or rearrange her expression into something more suitable for the occasion. She walked straight toward him, as if she had already decided that the house was the least interesting thing in front of her, and that he was the part worth paying attention to. He descended the steps and stopped 2 feet from her, and when her eyes met his they were brown and level, and entirely without the adjustment that most people made when they found themselves this close to him, that small, involuntary recalibration of posture and breath that power tended to produce in people, whether they intended it or not. She produced none of it. Her breathing was even. Her hands were relaxed. She looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they intend to understand accurately, and she waited, and the cold morning air moved between them, carrying the scent of wet earth and old stone, and somewhere behind the manor, a branch gave under the weight of the night's rain, and then the grounds were quiet again. "Miss Reed," he said, even precise. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice carried the same temperature as his. No warmth added, none removed, simply the exact register of a person who meets the world at its own level and does not adjust downward or upward for anyone. He had organized what to say next in the correct order on his way down the stairs, the terms of the arrangement, the schedule of the house, the expectations he intended to make clear from the beginning, but standing 2 feet from Anna Reed with the grey sky pressing down above them, the organized words did not arrive in their organized order, and the half-second of silence that followed was a half-second longer than he had planned for. "The East Wing has been prepared for you," he said. "My housekeeper will show you the house this morning. Dinner is at 7. There are expectations here that I will make clear in time." Anna held his gaze for one deliberate beat, past the moment when most people would have responded. Long enough that he registered it, long enough to understand it was a choice. And then she nodded, once, with the clean economy of someone who does not perform agreement they don't feel. "I understand," she said. "Not I understand and I will comply. Simply I understand." As if his expectations were received and she had her own, and neither of those things required further discussion. He turned and led her inside without looking back, hearing her steps on the stone behind him, steady, keeping exact pace, unhurried in both directions, and the entrance hall of Hale Manor opened around them, smelling of cold stone and leather and the low trace of coal from a fire that had been burning in the east room since early morning. The portraits of 3 centuries of his family ran the length of the wall to the right, and the staircase rose at the far end in a single sweep of dark wood, and the grey light came down through the high window above it and spread across the marble floor without warmth. Anna's steps slowed. She stopped in front of one of the portraits, a man from the previous century, painted with the careful stiffness of an era that considered stillness a form of dignity. He had Rowan's jaw. He did not have Rowan's eyes. "Your great-grandfather?" she asked without turning. The pause behind her lasted one beat longer than it should have. "Yes," Rowan said. "He looks like a man who was always right," she said. "He believed he was," Rowan answered. "That's not the same thing," she said quietly, and turned from the portrait with the ease of someone who states a truth and moves on from it without waiting to see where it lands. The expression that crossed Rowan's face in that moment lasted less than 2 seconds, something brief and unguarded that moved behind his eyes before the composure he had spent years perfecting organized it away. She saw it. She filed it without comment, the way she filed everything that mattered, carefully in the part of her mind that kept accurate records and did not rush to conclusions. Mrs. Holt appeared from the corridor to the left, a woman of around 50, with the posture of someone who had served this house long enough to love it honestly and know all its difficult corners. She looked at Anna with the quiet, thorough attention of someone who had long since developed her own reliable system for reading people, and then she looked at Rowan, and something moved briefly across her face. Not surprise, but the expression of a woman who recognizes the beginning of something, and knows better than to name it out loud before it is ready to be named. "Miss Reed," she said, "I'll show you the house whenever you're ready." "Thank you," Anna said, and then turned to Rowan one final time, meeting his eyes with the same direct, unornamented attention she had carried through every moment of the past quarter hour. "The house is extraordinary," she said. "I can see it was built to last." "It was," he said. "So was I," she answered. "No challenge in it, no performance, just the quiet and complete certainty of a person who discovered the truest thing about herself through difficulty and no longer needed anyone's permission to believe it." She followed Mrs. Holt toward the stairs, and Rowan stood alone in the entrance hall of the manor his family had held for 3 centuries and listened to her footsteps climb away from him, steady, unhurried, entirely her own. The portraits watched from the walls. The grey light lay flat across the marble floor. The house was exactly as it had always been, and the smell of cold stone and old wood was the same as it had been every morning of his life. And yet something in the quality of the silence felt different, not emptier, but fuller, the way a room feels when something that was always missing has just without announcement arrived. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to. Then he walked back to his study, sat at his desk and opened the estate accounts. The numbers were the same as they had always been. The columns were even. The figures added up exactly as they were supposed to. He worked through the morning with the precision that had always been his most reliable armor, and the precision held, and the work was done, and the estate of Hale Manor continued to function as it always had. But once, just once, he set his pen down and looked at the door of his study with the specific attention of a man who is beginning to understand that a door he has kept shut for a very long time is only still closed because he has not yet decided to open it. He picked up his pen. He returned to the numbers. The numbers were easier, but for the first time in years they were not enough. The library at the end of the west corridor had no particular hour. Rowan had learned that about it long ago, that it existed outside the schedule of the rest of the house, that the fire there burned lower and the silence there was different in quality from the silence everywhere else, the kind of silence that had collected over decades and had something in it worth keeping. He went there most nights, not because he needed to, because some rooms understand a person better than others, and he had stopped questioning that about this one. On Anna's 3rd night at Hale Manor she found it. He heard the door before he heard her, the soft shift of old wood on stone, the particular sound of someone who opens a door carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what might be on the other side. He was standing near the window, with one hand resting on the frame, looking out at the dark grounds the way he had looked at them for more nights than he could count. He turned. She stood just inside the doorway, with the low lamplight of the corridor still behind her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I didn't know you were here," she said. She didn't move to leave. "You don't need to go," he said. He turned back to the window. She came in without hurry. chose the armchair farthest from him, the one near the bookcase angled slightly toward the fireplace where the last of the evening's coals still held a low amber heat, and pulled a book from the shelf beside it without reading the spine. The room settled around them. The smell of old leather and cold ash and the faint sweetness of the dying fire filled the space between them, and neither of them required the other to explain their presence. It was Anna who spoke first, her eyes on the open page. "Is this where you come when the house gets too heavy?" she asked, and her voice was low and unhurried, the voice of someone asking a real question and willing to wait for a real answer. The muscle along Rowan's jaw moved once. "Something like that," he said. She turned a page. The coal in the grate shifted and settled. Outside, the grounds of Hale Manor lay dark and still, under a sky without stars, and Rowan looked at them the way he had looked at them on 100 nights before this one. But tonight, something in the looking was different, because someone else was in the room, and the silence was not the silence he had come here to find. He had not thought about the night in London for some time. He had trained himself out of the habit of it years ago, the way a man trains himself out of any habit that costs more than it gives, deliberately, patiently, one day at a time, until the absence of the thought became more natural than the thought itself. But standing at the window of the library with the smell of old leather in the air, and the quiet presence of Anna Reed in the chair behind him, something shifted without his permission, and the memory arrived the way memories do when your defenses are occupied elsewhere, through a side door without announcement. He had been 26. Her name was not something he said anymore, even to himself. He had made that decision early, and had held it cleanly. But the shape of that evening was still precise. The drawing room in London, the letter in his hand, the particular quality of the light through the tall windows, and the understanding that settled over him not with drama, but with the flat, final certainty of a door closing on a room you had believed was yours. She had accepted another man's offer 3 days before she was supposed to accept his. She had not told him. She had not told him because he understood later. She had never believed the thing between them was what he believed it was, and she had not known how to say so, and so she had simply moved forward and left him to discover it from a page of someone else's handwriting. He was not angry at her. He had decided that early, too. What he had not been able to decide was what to do with the part of himself that had trusted completely and been simply, quietly, wrong. Not because his judgment had failed, but because the trust had been real on his side and not on hers, and no amount of careful reasoning had ever explained to him how to protect a person from that particular kind of loss. So he had done the only thing that made sense to a man of his precise and disciplined nature. He had removed the variable. He had returned to Hale Manor, and he had given himself to the duty of the estate, to the honor of the family name, to the inheritance his father had left him, to the responsibility of the tenants and the land and the 3 centuries of promise held in every stone of this house. And he had called that a life, and it had been, and he had been, within those terms, entirely sufficient. Until 6 days ago, when a woman had stepped off a carriage in his drive and looked at him without adjustment, and said, "So was I," with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. The coal in the grate shifted again. Anna turned another page, and the soft sound of it moved through the library like something small and certain, and Rowan's hand pressed slightly harder against the window frame before he was aware of it. He released it, turned from the window, sat in the chair near the fireplace without explaining the movement, and the brandy on the side table remained exactly where it was, untouched, because he had carried it up out of habit and had no intention of needing it. They sat in the low amber heat of the dying fire for a while longer without speaking, and when Anna finally closed her book and rose, she set it on the side table rather than returning it to the shelf, a small and unconscious thing, the gesture of someone who intends to come back. She said good night and left, and her steps in the corridor outside were quiet and even, and then gone, and the library returned to its ordinary silence. Rowan stayed where he was. After a time he got up and went to the bookshelf to return the volume she had left on the table, and when he read the spine, he was still for a moment. It was the collection of letters he had not opened in 9 years, the correspondence between 2 people separated by circumstance, who had written to each other honestly for 20 years, the book he had read 4 times in his 20s and had not touched since the night he came back from London. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he placed it back on the shelf, Not in the position she had taken it from, but in its correct place, the place he had kept it for 9 years without opening it, and he stood there a second longer than necessary, with 2 fingers still resting on the spine. The presence of Anna Reed in this house was not going to be the manageable, contained 6-month arrangement he had decided it would be. He had known that from the moment she looked at his great-grandfather's portrait, and said that's not the same thing without waiting to see if he agreed. He had simply not been ready until this moment to let himself know it. The rain arrived on a Tuesday and made itself at home. It was the kind of rain that Yorkshire does better than anywhere else. Not violent, not dramatic, just persistent and grey and complete. The kind that settles into the stones of an old manor and makes the indoors feel like the only honest place to be. The grounds disappeared behind it, the garden became a suggestion, and Hale Manor, which was already a serious house, became more serious still. Its corridors longer, its rooms quieter, its fires more necessary than they had been the day before. Rowan worked through the morning the way he always worked, with his door closed, his correspondence in order, his attention given fully to whatever was in front of him. It was the discipline that had held him together for 15 years, and it was reliable, and he trusted it. What he did not trust, by the 2nd hour of the 2nd day of rain, was his own ability to keep his attention where he had placed it. Because somewhere in the east wing, Anna Reed was moving through his house, and the sound of her, or the absence of it, had begun to occupy a part of his mind that he had not assigned to her. He found her in the map room just after noon. The door was open. She had spread the Northern Estate Survey across the central table and was bent over it with a straight edge and a pencil, her coat still on, her hair slightly damp at the edges from the short walk she must have taken between wings before the rain made that impossible. She was measuring something along the boundary of the northern field with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who has done this kind of work before, not studying the map, reading it, the way a person reads something they already have the language for. She didn't hear him in the doorway. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended. "Those are estate surveys," he said. She looked up without starting, her pencil still resting on the paper. "Mrs. Holt showed me the reading room yesterday. These were on the open shelf," she said, with the calm directness he had come to recognize as simply the way she communicated. No apology in it, no defiance, just the plain delivery of relevant fact. "I wasn't looking for them. I was looking for something to read, and I know how to read these, so I did." He walked in, stood on the opposite side of the table and looked at what she had marked. She had traced the northern boundary with a careful line and noted, in a small and precise hand in the margin, a measurement that looked different from the one in the official survey. He looked at it for a moment. "What did you find?" he asked. "The baseline is wrong," she said without hesitation. "Whoever measured this started from the old stone marker near the creek, but that marker moved years ago. You can see it in the soil pattern here." She pointed with the pencil, not at him, but at the map, the gesture of someone explaining rather than performing. "Everything calculated from it is off, not by much, but enough to affect the drainage projection for the whole northern section. The real boundary runs about 30 feet further east." Rowan looked at the line she had drawn. He looked at the official figure beside it. His land steward had submitted that survey 14 months ago, and he had reviewed it, and he had not seen what she found in an afternoon with a straight edge and the particular attention of someone who had learned this not from a textbook, but from the slow and difficult education of necessity. The muscle along his jaw moved once. "How do you know where the marker moved?" he asked. "My father's estate had the same problem," she said, and her voice was even, but something underneath it was not, something that was there for only a moment before she continued, the briefest tightening of the sentence, the sound of a word carrying more weight than the speaker intends. "We lost 2 seasons of correct drainage calculations because of it. I learned to check." She straightened, set the pencil down, looked at him across the table with the level, unhurried gaze that he was beginning to understand was not indifference, but its precise opposite. The gaze of someone who is paying complete attention and has nothing to hide about the fact. He looked at the map for a moment longer, then he looked at her. "Leave it as it is," he said. "I'll review it this evening." She nodded and began to gather her things from the table with the easy efficiency of someone moving on to the next thing, and Rowan stayed where he was for a moment, watching her hands smooth the corner of the map back into place with the particular care that people give to things they respect. Her hands were not the hands of a woman who had spent her life in drawing rooms. There was a practicality to them, a competence worn into the skin the way competence always is. Not from training, but from use, from the long habit of doing what needed doing, because there was no one else to do it. "You managed your father's estate yourself," he said. It was not a question. "For the last 2 years of his life, yes," she said. She picked up her straight edge and her notes without looking up. "My brother was in London." She said it the same way she said most things, plainly, without editorial, without the performance of pain or the performance of acceptance. She said it the way someone says a fact that is simply true, that they have already finished being surprised by, that they carry without requiring it to be witnessed. And yet the plainness of it was its own kind of weight, and Rowan felt it settle in his chest with the specific gravity of something that deserves more than the 3 words she had given it. He didn't say anything further. She finished gathering her things and looked up at him once, a brief level glance that was not asking for anything, not offering anything, just present, just accurate. And then she moved toward the door. She paused at the threshold, not turning fully, her hand resting on the frame the way a person rests their hand on something solid without thinking about it. "The eastern drainage line," she said. "If you correct the baseline, the projected cost drops by more than 1/3. I wrote the calculation in the margin." Then she walked out into the corridor, and her steps moved away down the stone floor, even and quiet and entirely her own, and Rowan stood in the map room with the survey in front of him and the smell of damp wool and old paper in the air. And he looked at the line she had drawn in the margin, small and precise and more useful than 14 months of official reports, and felt something move in his chest that had nothing to do with drainage calculations. That evening he reviewed the survey. The baseline was exactly where she said it was. The correction was exactly what she had calculated. He made a note to his land steward in the morning, clear and specific, and then he sat for a while with his pen in his hand and did not immediately write anything else, because he was thinking about a woman who had walked into his map room in a damp coat and found in one afternoon what no one else had thought to look for in over a year, and who had told him about it with the same quiet matter-of-factness with which she told him everything, as if being useful was simply what she did, as if doing it without recognition was simply what she expected, as if she had made peace long ago with the fact that the things she gave rarely came back to her in equal measure. He put his pen down. He looked at the fire. Outside, the rain continued, steady and grey and patient, the way it always was in Yorkshire when it had decided to stay, and the corridors of Hale Manor were quiet, and somewhere in the east wing a door closed softly, and Rowan Hale, who had spent 15 years being sufficient unto himself, sat very still in his study and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the walls of this house were not as complete as he had always believed them to be. The last week of October arrived with shorter days and a cold that had weight to it now. Not the sharp, passing cold of early autumn, but the kind that settles into stone and stays, the kind that makes fires necessary rather than comfortable, and turns the late afternoon light into something thin and golden and brief. The grounds of Hale Manor took on the particular beauty of a landscape, preparing itself for winter. The trees along the east field stripped to their shapes, the garden wall dark with moisture, the sky by 4 o'clock already moving toward the deep blue that precedes dark. Rowan noticed all of it the way he noticed everything, precisely without sentiment. What he had not noticed until the last week of October made it impossible to ignore was the degree to which Anna Reed had become part of the texture of his days. It had happened without a defined moment. There was no morning he could point to and say, "This is when it changed." It was more the way a season changes, gradually, in accumulated degrees, until one day the air is different, and you understand that something has shifted, without your having witnessed the exact instant of the shift. He knew now, without having decided to know it, that she took her tea without sugar, but held the cup in both hands when the morning was cold. He knew that she read with the particular stillness of someone genuinely inside a book and not performing the act of reading. He knew that when something amused her, truly amused her, not the social variety, the corner of her mouth moved before the rest of her face decided what to do about it, a fraction of a second ahead of everything else, like a thought that escaped before it could be organized. He knew these things the way you come to know the details of something you have been paying attention to without admitting it to yourself. On a Thursday afternoon near the end of the month, he went to the stables earlier than usual and found her already there. She was standing near the grey mare at the far end of the row, one hand resting on the horse's neck, with the easy familiarity of someone who had grown up around animals and retained the particular stillness that horses require and reward. She didn't hear him come in. The stable smelled of hay and leather, and the warm living smell of horses in cold weather, and the grey mare had her head low and her eyes half closed under Anna's hand, and the quality of the scene, the amber light from the stable lantern, the stillness of both of them, the cold October air coming in at the open end of the row, stayed with Rowan for a moment before he spoke. "You ride," he said. She turned without starting. She never started, he had noticed, never produced the sudden flinch of a person caught in something private. She simply turned, the way someone turns when they were always prepared to be seen. "Since I was a child," she said, "my father taught me." He looked at her hand still resting on the mare's neck, and the mare turned her head slightly toward Anna, the way horses turn toward people they have decided to trust, and something in that small animal judgment landed in Rowan's chest with a warmth he did not immediately examine. "I ride the northern fields on Thursday afternoons," he said. "The tenant farms." He paused. It was a half-second pause, the kind that comes before a sentence a person has not fully decided to say. "You could come if you wanted to." The words were out before the decision was entirely made. He was aware of that. He was also aware in the same moment that he did not want to take them back. Anna looked at him for a moment, with the level attention that was simply how she looked at things. Then she looked back at the mare, and the corner of her mouth moved, that fraction of a second ahead of everything else, and she said, "I'll get my coat." They rode out together into the last of the afternoon light, the cold air sharp and clean against their faces, the fields stretching away on either side in their late October colors, brown and gold, and the dark green of wet grass that would not be green much longer. Rowan set a pace that was brisk without being hurried, and Anna matched it without effort, riding with the easy, upright confidence of someone for whom a horse is not a performance, but simply a way of moving through the world. He noticed. He noticed the way her hands were light on the reins, and the way she read the ground ahead without appearing to, and he thought about the 2 years she had spent managing an estate alone, and he understood that this, riding, reading land, knowing how things worked, was not accomplishment in her case. It was simply survival, absorbed into the body until it no longer required thought. The first farm they stopped at belonged to an older couple, the Malloys, who had worked the southeast corner of the Hale estate for over 30 years. Thomas Malloy came to the gate with the particular greeting he reserved for Rowan, respectful, direct, without ceremony, and then looked at Anna with the measured curiosity of a man who does not form opinions quickly. Anna looked back at him with the same quality of attention, and she said his name after Rowan introduced her, and she asked one question about the season's yield that was specific enough that Thomas Malloy answered it fully, and with something that was, by the end of the answer, close to approval. They moved on to 3 more farms before the light began to fail, and at each one Anna said little, and listened carefully and asked, when she asked anything, the kind of question that told the person answering it that they had been accurately heard. She did not try to charm anyone. She did not perform warmth she didn't feel. She was simply present, simply attentive, simply herself. And Rowan watched from the slight distance that the role of host required and felt the word arrive in his chest before he could stop it. Admiration. Not the social variety, not the kind a man feels for a performance, the kind that comes from witnessing someone be completely and honestly themselves in a difficult circumstance and finding that who they are is more than adequate, is, in fact, more than he had encountered in a very long time. On the ride back, the sky had gone to the deep blue of late October dusk, and the first stars were coming through in the east, and their horses moved side by side along the field path with the quiet rhythm of animals that had found their pace together. They had been silent for a while, a silence that was comfortable in the way that silences between people become comfortable when both people have stopped needing to fill them, when the quiet itself has become a kind of conversation. "You know what you're doing out there," Rowan said. He was looking at the path ahead. "With the tenants." Anna was quiet for a moment. The horses moved. The cold air smelled of frost and wet earth and the distant trace of wood smoke from the farms behind them. "My father believed that the people on the land were the land," she said. "That if you didn't know them, really know them, not just their rents, you didn't really know what you were responsible for." She paused. He was right about most things. The way she said that last sentence, he was right about most things, carried the specific weight of a person speaking about someone they loved and have lost. The weight that settles differently from grief, because it is not grief anymore, just the permanent shape that grief leaves when it finishes moving through a person. Rowan heard it. His hands were still on the reins, and his eyes were on the path. But something in him went very quiet. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," he said. "He was," she said simply. They rode the rest of the way back in silence, and it was the deepest kind of silence, the kind that holds something real between two people without requiring either of them to name it. When they reached the stables and dismounted and handed their horses to the groom, they walked back toward the manor side by side in the last of the evening light, their breath visible in the cold air, the dark shape of Hale Manor rising ahead of them with its lit windows warm against the dusk. At the side door, Anna stopped and looked up at the manor for a moment. Not the way she had looked at it the morning she arrived, reading it like a problem, but differently, with something in her expression that was quieter and less defended, and that she did not appear to notice she was showing. Then she looked at him briefly, with the level brown gaze he had come to know better than he had intended to. "Thank you," she said, "for asking me to come." He held her gaze for one beat longer than he should have. The cold air moved between them, and the light from the manor windows caught the edge of her face, and the frost was beginning to form on the gravel, and the evening was very still. "You were useful," he said, and even as he said it he knew the word was wrong. Too small, a word chosen because the true one was not yet something he was ready to say out loud. Something moved in her eyes, brief and contained, there and then organized away. "Good," she said, and went inside. Rowan stood at the door for a moment after it closed behind her. The frost was settling on the gravel. The manor was lit and warm and 3 centuries old, and somewhere in the space between useful and what he had actually meant, something he had been telling himself was under control quietly, and completely was not. November arrived the way it always arrived in Yorkshire, not with announcement but with accumulation, grey pressing down on grey until the last of October's colour was gone and the landscape became something starker and more honest, the kind of beauty that asks something of the person looking at it. It was in the second week of November that Anna found the letters. She had not been looking for them. She had gone to the library in the late afternoon to return a book she had borrowed 3 days before, and the fire had been lit early against the cold, and the room had the amber warmth that made it difficult to leave quickly. She set the book on the side table and noticed, on the lower shelf near the window, the shelf she had not explored yet, the one partially obscured by the wing of the armchair, a stack of correspondence, bundled with a faded ribbon, the colour of old rust. She would not have touched it. She was not a woman who touched things that did not belong to her, but the top letter had slipped from the bundle and fallen face up on the shelf, and the handwriting on it was not Rowan's, and the date on it was not recent, and the words visible above the fold were not the words of a business letter. She picked it up, read the visible lines, set it back exactly where it had fallen. She was still standing near the shelf when Rowan came in. He stopped when he saw her. Not dramatically, just stopped the way a person stops when they enter a room and find it different from what they expected. His eyes moved to the shelf, to the letter, back to her. And something happened in his face that she had not seen before, not the brief unguarded moment she had witnessed twice before, but something deeper and less contained, a tightening around the jaw and a stillness in the eyes that was not composure, but the effort of composure, which was a different thing entirely. She did not pretend she hadn't seen what she had seen. That was not who she was. "I didn't read it," she said. "It had fallen. I picked it up and put it back." He crossed the room, took the letter from the shelf and looked at it for a moment without opening it, and the firelight moved across his hands, and she could see, from where she stood, the slight whitening of his knuckles before he set it carefully back on top of the bundle and straightened. "They belong to my mother," he said. The voice was level. It cost him something to make it level. She could hear the cost, the way you can hear when someone is spending more than they want you to know. "She left them here before she died. I have not moved them." Anna was quiet. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside the library window, the November rain had started again, fine and cold, the kind that barely makes a sound against the glass. "How old were you?" she asked. 14, he said. The word sat in the room. 14. old enough to understand what was lost and young enough that the shape of the loss would set in the bones before a person had the language to name it properly. Anna knew something about that particular age of loss. Not a mother. Something different but adjacent, the kind of wound that comes from understanding too early that the world does not hold the people you love in place simply because you need them there. "I lost my mother when I was 12, she said. He looked at her. It was the first time either of them had offered something this interior, this unguarded, and the quality of the air in the library changed with it, not heavier but more honest, the way air changes when two people stop negotiating the surface of a conversation and arrive without planning to somewhere real. "My father raised me after that," she continued, and her voice was even but her hands were still at her sides, in the particular way that her hands were still when she was holding something carefully. He was not a man who found it easy to show what he felt, but he was present, he was always present, always. And when his mind began to go 2 years ago, slowly at first and then faster, I understood that I was going to lose the only person left who had known me my whole life. She paused. The rain moved quietly against the glass. I managed the estate, and I managed his care, and I managed my brother's absence, and I told myself it was enough to do the right thing, even if no one was watching. And mostly, I believed that. She looked at the fire. But there were evenings when the house was very quiet, and he was asleep, and I sat at the desk with the accounts in front of me, and I understood very clearly that I was completely alone, and that alone was simply what I was going to be. The room was very still. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, not with the careful, measuring attention he gave most things, but with something that had no management in it, something that was simply there, open, the way a window is open when someone has finally decided the room needs air. His jaw was tight. The firelight moved across his face, and she could see the exact moment that something he had been holding shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, but releasing, the way a thing releases when it has been held for long enough that the hands finally understand there is no longer a reason. "You were not alone because you were insufficient," he said. His voice was low and very precise. "You were alone because the people who should have been there were not." She looked at him. Something in her chest moved, quiet and deep, the way things move when a truth you have always known is finally said out loud by someone who is not you. "I know that," she said. "It took me a long time to know it." He crossed the room. Not quickly, not with the kind of urgency that announces itself, just moved steadily until he was 2 feet from her and the firelight was between them, and the library smelled of old leather and rain and the particular warmth of a room that has been lived in. He looked at her with the full, undivided attention of a man who has stopped dividing himself between what he feels and what he is willing to show. And Anna looked back at him with the steadiness that was simply who she was, and the space between them had a quality to it that neither of them moved to close, but that both of them felt the exact shape of. "My mother used to sit in that chair," he said, and nodded toward the armchair by the window, the one Anna had been sitting in since her 3rd night at Hale Manor, the one she had chosen without knowing, the one that caught the best light. "She read in the evenings. The house was different then." He stopped. "I have not thought about that in a very long time." "What was it like?" Anna asked. "The house when it was different." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear him deciding whether to answer, deciding how far to go, deciding perhaps for the first time in many years whether the cost of saying a true thing was less than the cost of leaving it unsaid. "Warm," he said finally. It was warm. There was noise in it, not chaos, just the ordinary sound of people living rather than managing. He looked at the fire. "When she died and then my father not long after, I took on the duty of the estate and I told myself the duty was sufficient. That honor and responsibility and the proper care of this inheritance were enough to build a life from." A pause, not hesitation, something more deliberate. "I have been telling myself that for a very long time." Anna held very still. The fire moved. The rain continued against the glass. Outside, the November dark was coming down over the fields of Hale Manor, over the tenant farms and the stone walls, and the 3 centuries of family name held in every acre of this land. And inside the library 2 people stood close to each other in the amber light and said the truest things they had said to another person in years, and neither of them looked away. "And now?" she asked, her voice quiet. His eyes came back to hers, and in them, for one full, unguarded second before the composure of 15 years moved to organize it, She saw the answer. Not the words of it. The thing itself. He didn't say it. Not yet. He was not a man who moved before he was certain, and he was not yet certain, and she understood that about him, and she did not need him to be certain yet, because what she had just seen in his face was already more than she had expected to find in this house, more than the cold grey morning of her arrival had promised, more than 6 months of duty had any right to become. "I am less certain than I was," he said. It was, from Rowan Hale, a great deal. She held his gaze for one long quiet moment. Then she looked at the rain against the window, and the fire in the grate, and the stack of letters on the low shelf with the faded ribbon, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution, not arrival, but the particular feeling of a door that has been closed for a very long time, standing at last, slightly open. "That's not nothing," she said softly. She picked up her book from the side table. She said good night, and she walked out of the library and down the long corridor toward the east wing, and her steps were the same as they always were, steady, unhurried, entirely her own, but something in the quality of them was different, lighter, the steps of a person who has set something down that they have been carrying for a long time without realizing how heavy it was. Behind her in the library, Rowan stood with the firelight on his face, and the rain against the glass and the letters on the shelf, and the particular silence of a room in which something real has just happened, and he did not move for a long time. He was not uncertain anymore. He simply needed to decide what to do with what he knew. The letter from Lord Declan arrived on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November, delivered with the regular post and sitting on Rowan's desk between an estate invoice and a report from his land steward as if it were an ordinary thing, which it was not, and Rowan understood that the moment he saw the handwriting. He opened it after breakfast, read it standing at his desk, which was not his habit. He usually sat, organized his papers, gave correspondence the proper attention a settled position allowed. But something about Declan's name on the envelope had produced in him a particular alertness, the kind that keeps a person on their feet without their deciding to be. He read it once. Then he set it on the desk and walked to the window, and looked out at the November grounds, the bare trees, the frost still on the north field at this hour, the long stone wall that separated the home farm from the eastern pasture, the wall that had stood for over 200 years, and that he had walked along as a child with his father, and that he had walked along alone every year since. The letter was polite. It was always going to be polite. Declan was a man who understood that the most effective pressure arrives without raised voices. He wrote that he had been thinking about the arrangement, that he hoped it was proving manageable for all parties, that he wondered whether a conversation about the terms of the inheritance might be timely, that he was available at Rowan's convenience, that he remained, as always, a devoted cousin and faithful servant to the family name. Every sentence was reasonable. Every sentence was a hand reaching towards something that did not belong to it. Rowan stood at the window for a long time. What Declan wanted was not complicated. He wanted the 6 months shortened, the condition of the will declared impractical or insufficiently met, and the northern properties redirected toward his own inheritance. He had been patient about it for nearly 7 weeks. That patience was now apparently at its limit, and Rowan understood, standing at the window with the frost on the north field and the bare trees and the 200-year-old wall all in front of him, that he had 2 choices. Manage this the way he had always managed threats to the estate, with precision and economy and without sentiment, or admit to himself that his reasons for refusing Declan had stopped being purely about the inheritance somewhere around the end of October. He found Anna in the garden just before noon. She was walking the east path in her coat and her practical boots, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands in her pockets, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who walks not to arrive somewhere, but because movement itself is useful. She heard him on the gravel and turned, and she looked at him the way she always looked at him when something had shifted, with the quiet, patient attention of someone who already senses the shape of what is coming and is willing to wait for the words. He stopped beside her on the path. The November garden was stripped back and honest around them, the rose canes bare against the stone wall, the last of the ivy dark and wet, the sky the flat grey of a day that has decided against both sun and rain and settled into something in between. He could see his breath and hers in the cold air, and the grounds of Hale Manor stretched away on every side in their winter colours, and he thought briefly and with a clarity that surprised him that this was his. All of this, the stone and the field and the cold air and the duty of it, the 3 centuries of promise held in this land, and that the thought did not feel at this moment like a burden. "I received a letter this morning," he said, "from my cousin Declan." Anna waited. Her hands were still in her pockets. Her eyes were on him. He wants to renegotiate the terms of the will, an earlier end to the arrangement. A conversation, he calls it, about the inheritance. He paused. What he means is that he wants the northern properties. He has always wanted them. He has simply been waiting to see whether I would give him an opening. "Will you?" she asked. Her voice was even, but her eyes were very steady on his, and in them, briefly, for just a moment before she organized it away, he saw something he had not seen in Anna Reed before. Not fear, not vulnerability in the way he might have expected. Something quieter and more specific, the expression of a person who has been moved on without their permission before and recognizes the early signs of it happening again and is preparing in their particular way not to show that it matters. His chest tightened. "No," he said. The word came out without preparation, without the careful framing he gave most things, without attaching it to the estate or the duty or the practical reasons that would have made it easier and less true. Just no, clean and final and entirely his own. Something in Anna's face changed, barely the way things change in a face that has learned to hold itself carefully, the slight easing of a muscle near her jaw, the breath that came and went a fraction more freely than the one before it. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she had been reading him since the day she arrived, with the accurate and patient attention of someone who does not rush to conclusions and does not need to. "Declan has been patient," Rowan continued. "He will not accept a simple refusal without understanding the reason for it. He will come here. He will ask questions. He will speak to people, to Mrs. Holt, to the solicitors, to anyone who might tell him something useful." He looked at the garden wall, at the bare rose canes, at the frost still caught in the low places between the stones. "I want you to know that before it happens. I want you to be prepared for it." "Why are you telling me?" she asked. He turned and looked at her. The cold air moved between them, and the grey November sky pressed down above the manor and the gardens and the fields, and Rowan Hale, who had spent 15 years being precise about everything except the things that cost him most to be precise about, looked at Anna Reed with the full and undivided attention of a man who has stopped managing the distance between what he feels and what he shows. "Because it concerns you," he said. "Because you have a right to know what is happening in a house you are living in, and because—" He stopped. 1 beat. 2. The frost on the garden stones, the bare canes against the wall, her breath in the cold air. "Because I do not want you to hear it from anyone else and think for even a moment that I considered it." The silence that followed was the kind that holds something real in it, not uncomfortable, not waiting to be filled, but full, the way silence is full when 2 people have just communicated something that the words around it were only partially capable of carrying. Anna looked at him for a long moment. "What will you tell him?" she asked. "That the terms of the will stand," he said, "that the arrangement continues as agreed, that the inheritance is not a matter for renegotiation." He paused. "And that he is welcome to visit Hale Manor at his convenience, as a cousin and a guest, and that I will receive him as such." The corner of Anna's mouth moved, that fraction of a second ahead of everything else, the thing he had come to know better than she probably realized. "That's very precise," she said. "I'm a precise man," he said. "I know," she said quietly. And the way she said it, not as observation, not as judgment, but as something she had accepted and, it seemed, had found, against all expectation, sufficient, settled in his chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold air or the grey sky or the bare November garden around them. They walked back toward the manor together along the east path side by side, their steps even on the gravel, their breath visible in the cold air between them. They did not speak again before reaching the side door. But when Anna stopped at the threshold and turned to go inside, she paused for just a moment, with her hand on the doorframe, not looking at him, looking at the garden, at the bare wall and the stripped rose canes, and the frost-grey sky above it all, and he saw in the line of her shoulders and the quiet of her profile something he had not seen in her before. The expression of a person who has just understood that the place they are standing in is unexpectedly and against all original intention, somewhere they want to be. She went inside without saying anything further. Rowan stood on the path for a moment with the cold air on his face and the manor behind him, and the November grounds stretching away in every direction, and he thought about the letter on his desk, and the cousin who had written it, and the inheritance that had brought Anna Reed to his door, and he understood with the clarity of a man who has finally stopped arguing with himself that the inheritance was the least important part of any of it. He went inside. He sat at his desk. He wrote to Declan 2 sentences, exact and final. The arrangement stood, and the terms of the will would be honored in full. He sealed it. He gave it to the post. Then he sat for a while in the quiet of his study, with the November light coming through the window, and the estate accounts open in front of him, and the sounds of the house around him. A door somewhere in the east wing. Mrs. Holt's steps in the corridor, the low settling of the fire. And he let himself, for the first time in 15 years, simply sit inside his own life without managing it. It felt, he thought, like the first honest breath he had taken in a very long time. Declan arrived on a Friday afternoon in the last week of November. He came with 1 bag, and the particular ease of a man who has rehearsed his own casualness, the kind of ease that is not ease at all, but a performance of it, designed to make the person receiving it feel that nothing significant is happening when everything significant is happening. He shook Rowan's hand at the entrance with a warmth that was 1 degree too much, looked at Hale Manor, the way men who want things look at things they want, and said that it was good to be here, that he had been meaning to visit for months, that the house looked well. Rowan received him the way he received everything he did not trust, with perfect courtesy and complete attention. Anna was not at dinner that first evening. She had said simply that she thought it better to give them the evening and that she would be in the library if anyone needed anything. Rowan had looked at her when she said it, looked at her the way he looked at her now, which was differently from the way he had looked at anything in a long time, and he had not asked her to change her mind, because she was right, and because she had understood the situation without his having to explain it, and because that he had come to understand was simply who she was. Declan asked about her at dinner. Casually, with the practiced lightness of a man asking about the weather when he means to ask about the storm, he asked how the arrangement was going, whether it had proven more complex than expected, whether 6 months was truly necessary, or whether a practical man might find a reasonable way to fulfill the spirit of the will in less time. Rowan answered each question with the same precision he had used in his letter, directly, without elaboration, without leaving any edge for Declan's hand to find. The arrangement was proceeding as agreed. The terms were clear. The will was not a matter for interpretation. Declan smiled and changed the subject, and the evening continued, and the fire in the dining room was warm, and the wine was good, and everything was perfectly civil, and underneath the civility something moved like cold water under ice, present, patient, waiting. He stayed 2 nights. On the 2nd day, he walked the grounds with Rowan in the morning, and he spoke about the family name with the particular reverence that people use for things they want to take from you, and he asked, as if the thought had only just occurred to him, whether Rowan had considered what it would mean for the estate to have a proper mistress. A real one, he said, meaning a match of consequence, meaning Lady Portsmouth, whose name he introduced into the conversation with the practiced ease of a card placed on a table that has been in his hand for weeks. Lady Portsmouth, whose family had lands adjacent to the northern properties. Lady Portsmouth, whose connection to Hale Manor would, Declan said, be considered entirely natural by society. Lady Portsmouth, who was, he added, with the smile of a man who believes he has just played the hand that ends the game, available. Rowan looked at the bare November fields and the stone wall, and the frost on the ground, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said that he appreciated Declan's interest in the estate's future, that he would give the matter the consideration it deserved, that he was grateful for the visit. Declan left on Saturday morning satisfied, which was exactly what Rowan had intended. That Saturday evening the house was quiet in the particular way that it was quiet after the presence of someone who had required management, relieved, slightly larger than it had felt for 2 days, returned to itself. Rowan sat in the library after dinner with a book he was not reading, and the fire was high because the last of November had turned genuinely cold, and the frost was thick on the garden outside the window, and after a while he heard her steps in the corridor, and then Anna was at the door. She came in without ceremony and sat in her chair, the one that had been her chair since the 3rd night, the one that had been his mother's, The detail he had told her in the library 2 weeks ago and had not regretted telling her once since. She looked at him across the firelit room with the level, patient attention that was simply how she looked at him now. And he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the fire moved in the grate, and the frost was on the garden, and the house was quiet around them. He spoke about Lady Portsmouth, Rowan said. Anna was still. I see, she said. He believes a match there would resolve the question of the inheritance more neatly than the current arrangement. He paused. He is not entirely wrong about the practical logic of it. Something moved in Anna's hands, the briefest tightening of her fingers against the arm of the chair, there and then released, a thing so small that most people would not have seen it. He saw it. He had learned to see her the way she had learned to see him, accurately, without rushing, without looking away from what was actually there. I understand, she said. Her voice was even. She was very good at even. He knew now what it cost her. Anna. He said her name, her given name, the first time he had said it, and the sound of it in the quiet library was different from any other word he had said in this room, different in the way that things are different when they are true. She looked at him. I am not telling you this because I am considering it, he said. I am telling you because I told you in the garden that I would not let you hear things from anyone else and think for even a moment that I had. The fire, the frost on the glass, the quiet house, her fingers released the arm of the chair fully. Something in her face, in the careful, composed surface of it that she had maintained through so much and for so long, went very slightly and very quietly, soft, not collapse. The opposite of collapse. The particular softness of a person who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and has just been given, carefully and without drama, permission to hold it less tightly. Thank you, she said, very quietly. He nodded. He looked at the fire. She looked at the fire. They sat together in the library in the last of November, with the frost outside and the warmth inside, and everything that had been building between them for 8 weeks, present in the room as fully as either of them, and neither of them moved toward it yet, because this was not yet the moment. He knew it was not, and she knew it was not, and the knowing of it together was itself a kind of intimacy. After a while she picked up her book. He picked up his. The fire dropped lower, and the room grew closer, and the November night pressed against the windows, and they read in the same silence they had been reading in since the 3rd night of her stay, the silence that had stopped being the silence of two strangers and had become something else, something that had a shape and a warmth and a future in it, if both of them were willing to walk toward it. He was not yet certain she was. He needed to be certain. And so he did what he had always done with the things that mattered most to him. He held them carefully. He gave them the time they required, and he waited until he was sure. But that night after she said good night and went to her room and the library was empty, Rowan sat alone with the dying fire and the frost on the garden, and thought about her name in his own voice, Anna, and understood, with the quiet and complete certainty of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself, that there was no version of the next 6 months, or the 6 months after that, or any of the months that followed, in which this house made sense to him without her in it. He was not afraid of that. For the first time, he was not afraid of that at all. December came in quietly. The first morning of it arrived with a frost so complete that the entire grounds of Hale Manor looked as if someone had pressed silver into every surface overnight. The garden wall, the bare rose canes, the gravel in the drive, the long field beyond the east gate. It was the kind of morning that made old houses feel most like themselves, solid, permanent, built for exactly this kind of cold and entirely unbothered by it. Rowan was up before the light. He had slept, but lightly in the way a person sleeps when something has been decided and the body knows it before the day has given the decision anywhere to go. He dressed without assistance, the way he preferred on mornings when he needed to think, and he went down to the study and stood at the window and looked at the frost on the grounds in the grey pre-dawn light, and he let himself be clear about what he was going to do. He had spent 3 days being certain, not deciding. He had decided in the library on the last night of November, with the dying fire and the frost on the glass, and her name in his own voice. What the 3 days after that had been for was the kind of examination that a man of his nature required before he moved on something that mattered. Not doubt, not hesitation, but the honest and thorough accounting of a person who has been wrong before and understands the difference between wanting something and being ready for it. He had looked at every angle. He had looked at what he was offering and what it required, and whether he was capable of it. Truly capable, not in the practical sense, but in the sense that mattered more, the willingness to remain open, to remain present, to not retreat into the precision and distance that had served him so well and cost him so much. He was ready. He was more ready than he had been for anything in 15 years. He found her in the garden just after the light came up. She was standing near the stone wall at the east end, the one covered in frost-white ivy, her coat dark against the silver morning, her breath visible in the cold air. She was looking at something in the bare branches of the old tree that grew against the wall. A bird, he saw as he came closer, a small brown thing that sat on the highest branch with the perfect stillness of a creature that has decided the cold is simply the condition of the morning and sees no reason to resist it. She heard him on the gravel and turned. She looked at him with the level, unhurried attention she had been giving him since the first morning, since the wet gravel and the pewter sky, and so was I. And she waited, because that was who she was, and she had always given him the space his words required. He stopped 2 feet from her. The frost was on the ground between them, and the air was very cold, and the bird in the bare tree above the wall was still, and the grounds of Hale Manor were quiet in the particular way they were quiet on a winter morning, when the world had not yet started its noise. He looked at her steady brown eyes and the slight colour the cold had put in her face, and the particular quality of stillness she had that was not patience exactly, but something older and more earned than patience, the stillness of a person who has survived enough to know that the things worth having are worth waiting for. "I have something to say to you," he said. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her for a moment. The corner of her mouth was doing the thing it did, that fraction of a second ahead of everything else, the thought that escaped before it could be organized. And he understood that she had known, perhaps for longer than he had been ready to know it himself, and that she had waited, and that the waiting had been its own kind of answer. "I am not going to say this as a practical matter," he said. "I am not going to speak about the will or the arrangement or the inheritance or the 6 months. I am going to say it as what it is, which is the only way I know how to say things that are true." He held her gaze. The cold air moved between them. The frost on the garden wall caught the early light and held it. "I would like you to stay, not because the will requires it, and not because the estate needs it, and not because it is the reasonable and sensible conclusion to a circumstance that began with a document on my desk. I would like you to stay, because this house is different with you in it, and I am different with you in it, and I have spent 15 years being sufficient unto myself, and I find that I no longer want to be." The garden was very still. Anna looked at him with the full open attention of a woman who has stopped managing the distance between what she feels and what she shows, and in her eyes, in the steady brown that had looked at him without adjustment from the very first moment, he saw something he recognized because he had felt it himself, the particular expression of a person who has been hoping for something without allowing themselves to know it, and has just been given, cleanly and without condition, permission to know it. "I would like to stay," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely certain. He took 1 step toward her. She did not step back. The frost was between them, and the cold air was between them, and 15 years of careful distance was between them, and then it was not, because he raised his hand and touched her face, just the edge of his fingers against her jaw, the kind of touch that asks before it settles, and she turned her face very slightly into it, the way the mare in the stable had turned toward her hand, with the complete and unguarded trust of a creature that has decided, and Rowan Hale, who had not allowed himself to want anything this much in 15 years, felt something in his chest open like a window in a room that has been closed for too long, and the air that came through it was cold and clean and entirely necessary. He kissed her in the frost of the December garden, with the bare ivy on the stone wall and the bird still in the tree above them, and the grounds of Hale Manor silent and silver around them. And it was not a dramatic thing. It was a quiet thing, a certain thing, the kind of thing that feels not like a beginning but like the acknowledgement of something that has already been true for longer than either of them said it aloud. When they stepped back from each other, the bird in the tree above them shifted on its branch and then was still again, and the frost was still on the ground, and the morning was still cold, and Hale Manor stood behind them as it had always stood, solid, permanent, 3 centuries of stone and family name and duty and honour, and it looked in the early December light, exactly as it had always looked. And yet everything in it was different. 3 years later, July. The garden in the full heat of a Yorkshire summer was almost unrecognizable from the place it had been on the November morning Anna first walked its paths. The rose wall, the east wall, the one that had been bare and frost-white the morning Rowan found her standing beneath it, was covered now in a climbing rose that Anna had planted in the spring of their first year together, a deep red variety that had taken to the old stone, with an enthusiasm that no one had entirely anticipated, and that by the third summer had reached the full height of the wall and begun, with the particular ambition of things that have found their right place, to look for more. Rowan had said when it first went in that it was going to overwhelm the wall. Anna had said she thought the wall could manage it. They had both been right, in their respective ways, and the result was the kind of beautiful that neither of them had specifically planned for, which was, she had told him the previous summer, the best kind. The manor itself had changed in the way that houses change when they stop being managed and start being lived in, not dramatically, not in ways that a stranger would immediately name, but in the accumulated small ways that add up to something real. There were books in rooms that had not had books before. There were flowers on tables that had previously held only documents. The smell of the kitchen reached the east corridor at mealtimes now, which it had not done in Rowan's memory, before Anna decided that the door to the kitchen passage could remain open during the day without the world ending. Mrs. Holt, who had watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose patience had been thoroughly vindicated, had said nothing about any of it, and had felt everything. Rowan was at the garden door on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of July when he heard her. Anna was near the rose wall with their daughter, Eleanor, 2 years old in the spring, with her mother's eyes and her father's particular quality of attention, currently pressing both small hands into the warm July earth beside the base of the rose with the absorbed, purposeful concentration of someone conducting research of the highest importance. Anna was crouched beside her, saying something in a low voice, something about the roots, about how the rose knew where to go because it could feel the wall beside it, because growing towards something solid was not weakness, but sense. Eleanor looked up at her, with the expression that children have when the person they love most is explaining the world, as if the explanation and the love are the same thing, which at that age they are. Rowan stood at the garden door and did not announce himself. He watched Anna tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear with the back of her wrist, her hands still earthy, and say something that made Eleanor laugh. A full, unguarded 2-year-old laugh, the kind that has no self-consciousness in it whatsoever, the kind that arrives from the belly and goes straight up into the July air and stays there. Anna laughed too, quietly, the real kind, the kind he had learned to recognize over 3 years as different from every other version of her face. Open, unguarded, entirely present, the face of a woman who had survived difficulty and come out the other side of it, into something she had not known to expect. He had given her that, she had let him. Eleanor noticed him first, looked up from her research with the sudden, absolute attention of a small child who has spotted the other person who matters most, and said in the particular way she said most important things, which was loudly and without preamble, "Papa." Anna turned. She looked at him across the July garden with the steady brown eyes that had looked at him without adjustment since the first morning on the wet gravel, and the corner of her mouth moved. Still that fraction of a second ahead of everything else, still the thought that escaped before it could be organized, and she said nothing because she didn't need to. Because after 3 years, the language between them had long since moved past the need for most words. He walked across the garden toward them. Eleanor lifted both arms in the universal and entirely irresistible gesture of a child who has decided it is time to be picked up. And he lifted her, and she was warm and smelled of earth and summer and the particular sweetness of children in July. And she settled against his shoulder with the complete, unthinking confidence of someone who has never once doubted that this is where she belongs. Anna stood beside him. She looked up at him, and then she looked at Eleanor, and then she looked at the rose wall, at the deep red flowers, and the old stone behind them, and the July sky above them, and she took a slow breath of warm summer air and let it out, and the expression on her face was one he had seen before and would spend the rest of his life being grateful to know. The expression of a person who has arrived, fully and without reservation, at the place they were always supposed to be. "She got earth on her dress again," Anna said. "I know," Rowan said. "You're not going to say anything about it?" "No," he said. She looked at him, the corner of her mouth again. "Good," she said quietly. He reached for her hand. She gave it to him without looking. The easy, unconsidered way of people who have been giving each other their hands for long enough that the gesture no longer requires thought, only the simple willingness to reach. They stood together in the July garden of Hale Manor, with their daughter between them, and the old rose wall behind them, and the summer light on everything. And the house that had been cold and precise and sufficient unto itself for 15 years rose behind them warm and alive and entirely changed. Not because it had been rebuilt or reimagined, but because the people inside it had finally, after everything, chosen each other freely. And in a house built to last centuries, that turned out to be enough. More than enough. The most important thing of all.
No place to go, no second chance. A house of stone, a man of steel. A life that didn't ask how I feel. Cold gray sky, no warmth inside. 6 months bound, nowhere to hide. But I didn't bend, I didn't break. I wasn't his to shape or take. He looked at me like I'd disappear, like I'd be gone within the year. But something shifted in his eyes, and even he couldn't deny. I was built to stay, even when the world walks away. Not a shadow, not a phase, not something you can rearrange. And you were built to hide behind your walls, behind your pride. But somewhere in silence, you let me inside. I lived in numbers, lines and rules, in empty rooms, in careful truths. No room for loss, no room for pain, no space for anything that remains. Then you walked in, unafraid. No performance, no charade. You saw the cracks I couldn't see, and didn't try to fix me. I told myself you'd disappear, just another passing year. But every door I kept closed tight, you opened without a fight. You were built to stay, even when the world walks away. Not a shadow, not a phase, not something I could rearrange. And I was built to hide behind my walls, behind my pride. But somewhere in your silence, you changed my life. Not the will, not the name, not the land, not the claim. It was never about control. You became my only home. You were built to stay, and I was never meant to walk away. No more walls, no more disguise. I see my life in your eyes, and in a house that feared the light, you turned the dark into something bright. It wasn't fate, it wasn't chance, it was us all along. From cold stone to warm hands, from silence to where we stand. What began as just a stay became a life that chose to remain.